I'd like to begin this morning's seminar by highlighting the obvious. In the 9 months or so since I suggested this topic, the world has changed in ways no one could have predicted. At the time of writing this introduction, Iran and Israel were engaged in a tentative truce following the bombing of Iran. The Times newspaper published an article titled "Church of England Prepares for Serious War Involving UK," stating that the Church of England will prepare its parishes to act as a church in a time of conflict. The Telegraph published Church of England is preparing for UK at war. Similarly, the Methodist Forces Board, in their 2025 report to Methodist Conference, highlighted the deteriorating international security situation, the need for the Church to take actions to address a more unstable and dangerous world, and the requirement for work in the area of the theology and ethics of conflict and peacemaking, in providing resources for Methodists to engage in a supportive ministry towards the families of those serving in the armed forces, and to evaluate the board's own recruitment protocols should the armed forces urgently require more reserve and regular chaplains. Their 2025 report also stated they believe church communities will need to understand what it is to be a church in a time of conflict, and to be ready to speak and act in ways that are practically, pastorally, and theologically rich, with the need for the Church's published statements on issues of war and peace to be reviewed. Connectingly, however, the Methodist Church continues to stand by its 2006 report, Peacemaking, a Christian Vocation. Issued jointly with the United Reformed Church, this report concluded by stating that Christian debates about issues of peace and war have been dominated by the question of whether force can be used in the last resort. As a result, fundamental witness of the Church to the peaceful reign of Jesus Christ has been hushed and hesitant. It is time for this to change. We call on the members and leaders of the Methodist and URC churches, together with other Christians, to renew their commitment to be peacemakers they're called by God to be. Indeed, even the 2021 Justice Seeking Church report included peace as an example of how we can learn from our shared history, and as one of the 5 priorities for justice. It's easy to believe, therefore, that Methodism, in all of its forms, has always been in favour of peace and the avoidance of war at all costs. It's true that many Methodists do campaign on matters relating to this, but this is a vast oversimplification. This paper will therefore seek to undo this Methodist myth and understand better those who've gone before us. To help you and me to navigate this mammoth lecture topic, it will be divided into 4 sections. The first will cover the Wesleyan Normal Institution, later known as Westminster Training College, and its responses to war, primarily between 1914 and 1950. The second will then compare this, as far as I am able, to the attitudes of everyday Methodists. The third will set these against the statements and reports generated connectionally, and then I will compare these topics and evaluate the overall impact on the college, as well as British Methodism more generally. Starting with Westminster College. Its story begins in 1838 with the establishment of the Wesleyan Methodist Education Committee, or WMEC. This committee was established to oversee the growing Wesleyan education effort, with its aims of 700 schools nationally within 7 years. Whilst it did not achieve 700, it did manage to found over 300 by the time of the 1851 census, and over 800 by the close of the century. Whilst no comparison with the 10,000 schools managed by the Church of England, it was more than double that of the Catholic Church, which only managed 339. But in the mid-1840s, the WMEC established its desire to found a teacher training college to support the growing number of schools it managed, and to support the overseas missionary work the Church was engaging in. Indeed, in its 1849 report, the committee noted that the schoolmaster is equally necessary to the missionary as the minister at home. On the 7th of October 1851, the Wesleyan Normal Institution opened its doors. Located at 130 Horseferry Road in the city of Westminster, this site had been chosen so that the students, instead of being trained upon the distant banks of the Clyde, will have their training under the immediate cognizance and oversight of the Education Committee on the banks of the Thames. And so that this new college was not viewed as being merely a part of the Methodist educational enterprise, but as an essential part of the Methodist organisation for the work of God. Its students were both male and female, an unusual choice for the time. but solely and strictly Wesleyan Methodist in religious background. The church had previously sent students to the Free Church College in Glasgow, which is now part of the University of Strathclyde, but had been increasing the number of teachers it trained until it became more economically sensible to open their own institution. Its college was very grand, with reminding those who visited of the late medieval buildings of the older universities in Oxford and Cambridge. It featured a frontage of 3 gables divided by massive buttresses, each gable having an enriched oriel window, 2 stories in height. Its rear quad featured a view of the Houses of Parliament, whilst its front quad was decorated with bosses for the Wesley family, as well as ones featuring a patriotic VR. In 1868, its founding principal died suddenly, removing the initial directorial oversight of the Education Committee. The Reverend John Scott was replaced by the Reverend James H. Rigg, an educational statesman, who focused on ensuring that Wesleyanism and Methodism more generally began to be included in discussions around national education, an effort supported by a growing number of nonconformist members of Parliament. Indeed, S.C. Pritchard opened his centenary history of Westminster College with the remark that Methodism would not have won for herself the high place she held in the national life of this country by the close of the 19th century, had it not been for her educational enterprise. The Church's educational initiatives were further supported within the 19th century by the 1870 Education Act. This act established the principle of free provision of elementary education for all between the ages of 5 and 13, and formed local school boards to oversee their organisation and management. Notably, it was the first piece of legislation which created and regulated state provision of education, rather than just ensuring some of the funding for some children. Schools in London were overseen by the London School Board, of which J.H. Rigg was a founding member. Following this act and the increased need for qualified teachers, the WMEC established a second college in Battersea. Opening in February 1872, Southlands College took female students, whilst Westminster began to solely train men. At a managerial level, however, both colleges continued to be administered as effectively one institution. In 1902, the government enacted another key legislative directive, colloquially known as the Balfour Act. This Education Act sought to create a national education system that was systemic and rational. It also made increased provision for the funding of all schools, whether local authority board schools or those run by the voluntary sector, irrespective of denominational character. As a result of this and the potential funding for Catholic schools, the Act proved greatly unpopular with Methodists, with many refusing to pay the educational rates demanded in the legislation. Their reaction to the bill led to Balfour claiming that owing to the debate on the education bill, he was beginning to hate both education and religion. He did, however, identify that the existing educational system of the country is chaotic, ineffectual, and utterly behind its age, and makes us the laughingstock of every advanced nation in Europe and America. Eventually, a compromise was reached, and the Wesleyans quietened down, well, on this matter at any rate. In 1903, J.H. Rigg retired and was replaced by the Methodist scholar H.B. Workman. His reign as principal oversaw many of the notable changes in college history, including its evacuation during the First World War, its potential relocation to Leicester and Hull, and its close relationship with the University of London. To start with, however, Workman oversaw the extension of the college through the use of money raised in the 20th Century Fund. This project sought to raise 1 guinea from each of the 500,000 Wesleyan Methodist members and utilises money to create a lasting memorial to the Methodist movement. For the college, this saw £38,000 to fund the renovation of its practicing schools into additional living spaces and specialist teaching rooms. Following this peacetime timeline, in the July of 1914, H.B. Workman closed his logbook for the year by noting that its previous difficult term had ended and that college had finally gone down for what he hoped would be a relaxing summer. This was not to be. On August 4th, 1914, Britain went to war with Germany following its invasion of Belgium. In a telegram to the Admiral of the Fleet, George V remarked that Germany tried to bribe us with peace to desert our friends and duty, but Great Britain has preferred the path of honour. Within weeks of this declaration, Workman had summoned a group of college men back to Horseferry Road. By doing so, he hoped that these men would enlist together rather than being scattered throughout the British Armed Forces. A timeline of college history created in the early 1950s noted that 17 college students went into the London Regiment, 2nd City of London, 1st Reserve Battalion of Royal Fusiliers, and that by December, 66 had joined. By the start of the 1915-16 academic year, the college buildings had been requisitioned for the war effort. This was a move made at some speed, as Workman would later recall. He said that he had finished his inaugural address to the new students on the morning of Thursday, 23rd of September, and was about to go on with the usual routine of the day, when there came an urgent call from him on the telephone from the Office of Works. It was to state that the government of the Commonwealth of Australia were anxious to take the college as their military headquarters, and that officials would be round within the hour to survey the building. They came, and before lunch the matter was settled, barring some terms and conditions. He was asked to summon his various committees, and they met on the 30th, unanimously approving the project. The college then moved to Richmond College, elsewhere in London, and Richmond moved to Didsbury. Within a week of the proposal first being mooted, the Australian government were beginning to lay down telephone wires and other matters to effect the Great Change. The college buildings during the First World War and their use was later recorded by James Green, a senior chaplain in the Australian Imperial Forces. In his memoir's closing chapter, Green notes that Horseferry Road has its special place in our records. Thousands of Australians on business bent visited headquarters there. Indeed, the memorial to this use in college suggests that it was visited by some 330,000 individuals during the First World War, a number of which received a visit from George V and Queen Mary in October 1917. Green later notes that the college's role in empire building, partially through its role in the war effort and partially through its provision of teachers to a number of Commonwealth countries. He also reflects on the comforting nature of the college, and that to Horseferry Road the Australian came gladly, leaving it regretfully for war again. And when the war is over, it will be a kindly memory, before describing the way that war brought back in khaki men from Australia on business to the AIF headquarters, to find that it is their old college. It's evident, therefore, that both the collegiate family of staff, students and alumni, and its estate in Westminster, were of great use during the First World War. Other than this, the relocation of academic activities and a massive reduction in the number of students and staff, little changed during the war on the home front. In Europe, meanwhile, its men had been busy fighting. One notable example was alum William T. Forshore. He'd enlisted in the Manchester Regiment in March 1914 and was sent to Gallipoli in April 1915. In the August of this year, Forshore held a key strategic position against the army of the Ottoman Empire. Between the 7th and 9th of August, Forshore led by example, improvising bombs from jam jars and shrapnel, which he then lit with cigarettes that he continually smoked throughout the assault. For this work, his personal example, magnificent courage and endurance, Forshore became the first teacher to be awarded a Victoria Cross. The Daily Express noted that although teaching is about the last calling one would imagine as demanding in man, robustness of character and resourcefulness in conflict or competition, the born teacher is a disciplinarian. A second alum of the college, Donald Simpson Bell, also received a Victoria Cross. He was a professional footballer and awarded his medal for a role on the Western Front, taking out a machine gun post in the Somme. He later noted that it was the biggest fluke alive and he did nothing. He chucked the bomb and it did the trick. Bell was killed shortly after this, and his death would have an extensive impact on remembrance at the college. Whilst Forshore has no memorial at Westminster, Bell has a dedicated stained glass window and features on the memorial to the 149 men who died in the two world wars, 102 of them between 1914 and 19. It's worth noting, however, that this may be because Forshore died in 1943, when the college was evacuated during the Second World War, rather than because of a specific focus on death from war. This attempt to memorialise both Victoria Cross recipients can be seen in the college's desire to purchase Forshore's medals when they came up for sale in 1963. Ultimately, they were bought by his own old regiment, and Bell's Victoria Cross has become part of the collection at the National Football Museum in Manchester. Following the end of the First World War, College returned to Horseferry Road, and memorials to the fallen were erected. These took the form of the aforementioned window, dedicated to Bell, a series of wooden memorial boards, and in 1928, an organ purchased by students and alumni. In contrast, there are no memorials to those Westminsterians who chose peace during the war. John Brocklesby, for example, studied at Westminster between 1907 and 1909, overlapping with both Forshaw and Bell. In contrast to this pair, however, he was not a willing member of the armed forces. Instead, he was a conscientious objector, and in 1916 was taken before the Doncaster Military Tribunal, where he claimed objection to the war effort on religious grounds, specifically the sixth commandment of thou shalt not kill. He was sent to Richmond Castle before later being transferred to France. After the war, he was held in Winchester prison, then laboured at a stone quarry. When he learned that the stone was to be used on a military road, he refused to continue and served the rest of his sentence in prison. Upon his release, he joined the Friends War Victims Relief Service and served victims of conflict in Austria and Russia. The months and years that followed were a great struggle for Westminster and other similar male teacher training colleges. 6% of the male adult population in Britain had been killed in the war, and many who returned were physically or mentally scarred by the conflict. Eventually, however, life returned to normal, with the institution eventually outgrowing its site on Horseferry Road. They'd later purchased sport pitches in Tooting and then in Kent, with the intention of relocating the college to this site. Their sale was due to have been completed in 1939, with the sale complete in every sense but a legal one. At the outbreak of war, however, the Treasury vetoed this purchase by the Board of Education, and the buildings were eventually built as part of the college's centenary celebrations in 1951 and sold in 1959. In terms of the Second World War, the Second World War had less of an impact. 25 former students were killed, and the rest was saved, primarily due to teaching being allocated as a protected profession. As a collegiate body and a series of buildings, however, this war would prove far more destructive. Following an abortive move to move the college to Leicester in 1927, the National Board of Education assisted the college with creating the Westminster Experiment, which led to the college submitting students for an internal BA or BSc of the University of London, followed by a one-year teaching certificate at Westminster. When the University of London was evacuated in 1939, this led to a fracturing of the Westminster collegiate body. The collegiate body buildings, meanwhile, were once again requisitioned for the war effort. Its basement was utilised by the City of Westminster Council as an overflow mortuary, whilst another part of its estate was rented by the RAF as headquarters for one of its balloon squadrons. Externally, part of its buildings were utilised by the Office of Works as work and storage space, and its rear quadrangle was utilised by the London Fire Brigade, who stored equipment there in readiness for the predictable attacks on Westminster Abbey, the Palace of Westminster, and other government buildings on Whitehall. On the night of 4th-5th of March 1944, however, over 300 incendiary bombs were dropped on the college. They destroyed its dining hall and chapel, as well as the college art collection, library, archive, and furniture, all of which had been stored in the chapel. They also greatly damaged the principal's house. Despite this damage, the college reopened in 1945. One student described having to step around bomb craters in the front quad, the boarded over windows, and the use of an air raid siren in place of a dining bell. The state of the buildings were, more famously, also recorded by the artist John Piper. His work, now in the college art collection, shows the buildings as heavily damaged and covered in black soot and scorch marks. Although the buildings were fully repaired by 1948, its impact on those who would later lead the college varied greatly. Its principal between 1953 and 69, Trevor Hughes, looked back on his war service with pride. Donald Crompton, the principal who followed Hughes, had a different attitude. Unlike Hughes, Crompton had been a soldier in the East during the conflict and had been injured. His journal recorded his sense of indifference at VE Day and his relief but relative indifference on VJ Day as well. It's clear, therefore, that institutionally Westminster College battled between its Wesleyan desire to appear respectable and the Methodist desire for peace rooted in deep-rooted pacifism. Moving on to the second section of this paper, I hope to explore these more fully. What of the average Methodist? It's often assumed that all Methodists were pacifist. If this was the case, this paper would be much different, presenting the Methodist drive for peace on one hand and the perceived patriotic duty on the other. As is often the case, however, this narrative is a great oversimplification. Evidently, many of the average Methodists believed in the cause of the two world wars, either its moral purpose or patriotic duty to their country. For Westminster College, this led to 149 men being killed in both world wars. Similarly, H.B. Workman's response to the war, ensuring that college men enlisted together, was driven by pastoral concern for his students, as also seen in the college's monthly war bulletin. After all, Workman was, first and foremost, a minister. This once again demonstrates the imbalance provided by this binary narrative. Equally, Westminster men were not solely in favour of war, with conscientious objectors like Bert Brocklesby among their number. A similar scenario in favour of the college's commitment to peace can be seen in their staffing following the war, hiring various members of the armed forces and also Lewis Fry Richardson as a senior lecturer. Prior to the war, he'd been a physicist working for the Met Office, and as a Quaker and pacifist had refused to fight during the war, serving instead as an ambulance driver. Following the cessation of fighting in 1918, he returned to his work at the Met Office, but resigned when this office was merged with the War Office in 1919. He struggled to find employment elsewhere, primarily hindered by his perceived lack of war service. As a Methodist institution, however, Westminster welcomed him as one of its senior lecturers, and Richardson worked at the college for the majority of the following decade, eventually heading its physics department. Evidently, therefore, Westminster was an institution of conflicting views, far more nuanced than Methodist traditional narratives. Its students were active military servicemen, with individuals awarded both Victoria and George Crosses, the highest awards for bravery in both the armed forces and civilian service. Its students were also conscientious objectors, arrested following their refusal to serve. Similarly, members of staff in the 20s and beyond had military and peaceful employment histories. This is also reflected in two texts, Christianity and Universal Peace and Thinking Aloud in Wartime. The first, by A.W. Harrison, was published in between the two world wars, as is evident throughout the volume. The second, by Leslie Weatherhead, was published when peaceful due process had finished. Harrison's was published by the Methodist Church, meaning that this volume more closely reflects the views of the Church, whilst Weatherhead's volume found a secular company to publish it and is less likely to be influenced by this restraining factor. Similarly, his later publishing date does unfortunately mean that he had a greater data range to work with, and its immediacy in relation to wartime suggests it may accurately reflect the views of the everyday Methodist, whilst Harrison's volume could be more idealistic. Turning first to Christianity and Universal Peace, its author was a member of staff at Westminster College when the volume was published. He'd later succeed H.B. Workman as principal in 1930 and as secretary of the WMEC. He retired in 1940 and continued to hold the role of committee secretary. He was president of Methodist Conference in 1945, but died partway through his term in office. His life prior to Westminster College, however, was a varied one. He entered ministry in 1905, serving in Burnley and then Bristol. At the outbreak of war, Harrison chose to serve his nation in a different way, and within a year he was training as an officer and fought in France. In due course, he'd become a chaplain and won the Military Cross. He reflects on this in his published work, considering the opposing factors of being a Christian and engaging in warfare. He comments that the true Christian is certainly a peace at almost any price man, but then queries whether we can eliminate the word almost. He later reflects on the moral dilemma posed by the Prince of Peace wielding a whip of small cords to drive out the sellers of doves and sheep and oxen when challenging the moneylenders and gamblers in the temple. He later comments that St. Paul knew that Christ came not to bring peace, but a sword. He then comments that St. Paul admired the good qualities in the soldier and coveted them in the true Christian. He lists them as courage, an unflinching sense of duty, complete obedience to the general who'd enrolled them, and a true sense of discipline. Turning from St. Paul to John the Baptist, He observes that John the Baptist counselled the men who bore arms, do violence to no man. He did not, however, advise them to desert or to refuse to obey orders. Thus far, it would seem that this volume on universal peace is instead focused on the necessity of war and radical actions of early Christianity. Later on in the volume, however, Harrison turns on to different historical Christians, stressing that Wycliffe believed that the only just wars are those waged with God's justice. Thomas Aquinas, however, is quoted as stating that practices of warfare, which may be right and meritorious, are not in accordance with the holy calling of the priesthood. The complexity of the Methodist viewpoint, meanwhile, is highlighted with an example from its formative years, when Wesley's patriotism was so virile he could offer to raise a company of soldiers for home defence. Yet he had among his own preachers men like John Nelson who refused to bear arms. But the Methodists did not follow the Quakers as exponents of pacifism. This still doesn't seem to be supporting the overriding narrative that Methodists were pacifist in nature. Indeed, that last quote would suggest the very opposite. In its conclusion, meanwhile, Harrison recognises this, stating that our search does not seem to have brought us any very definite conclusions, and that our Lord has left us no legislation on the subject. Both comments later mirrored in the 2006 statement on the subject. Turning to the second volume and its context in the Second World War. Its author, Leslie Weatherhead, shares many biographical similarities with Harrison. Born a decade later and educated at Richmond rather than Didsbury, Weatherhead was also a military chaplain during the First World War and served alongside Harrison with the Devonshire Regiment. He too returned to ministry after the war, serving in Madras, Leeds, and London. He was president of conference a decade later than Harrison and died in 1976. Unlike Harrison, Weatherhead's book, Thinking Aloud in Wartime, an attempt to see the present situation in the light of Christian faith, found a secular home, published by Hodder and Stoughton in 1940. Also, unlike Harrison's work, it did not have the fortune of being published in a time of peace, something he addresses in the book's preface. Its text is, I suspect, reflective of an attitude shared by many today. He states that many Christian people at the present time are in considerable mental distress because they can't fit either pacifism or the support of war into the scheme of things. The pacifist position can easily be stated and has much to commend it, yet it leaves questions of vital importance unsolved. A topic described, as John Scott Lidgett quoted in this book, as being the most difficult impersonal philosophy. Weatherhead begins his book by being far clearer in his promotion of the benefits of peace. He does so to illustrate beastliness and waste and evil of war. He states that the Great War lasted 1,600 days. On each day, 7,000 men were killed and 14,000 wounded. 9 million men were killed and 14,000 wounded. 9 million children made orphans, 5 million women made widows, thousands driven mad. He further claims that the present troubles were due to the reaction of a proud people to the intolerable humiliation imposed upon a defeated enemy, thus meaning that the grim madness had again seized the world. Continuing his examination of the waste caused by the First World War, Weatherhead writes that the waste of money is bad enough. The British Exchequer during the Great War paid out 9.5 billion, and one thinks with some longing of what even a small part of that money might have done in splendid enterprises such as cancer research. He further notes that we lent 2.07 billion to allies and lost 750 million. He concludes this statistical examination by returning to the impact on people, mourning the impact on individuals. He notes that of British subjects, 9.5 million served in the Army, Navy, and Air Force, and 1/10 were killed. Between 1/5 and 1/4 wounded, and 22,000 civilians killed or drowned at sea. These people, he states, were intended by God to carry the torch of man's progress and to bring advancement, prosperity, and peace. For churches, Weatherhead also mourns the loss, noting that hundreds today would have been office bearers in our churches are God knows where. He comments that because Hitler will not agree with Chamberlain or keep his pledged word, I'm invited to kill a German minister with whom I have far more in common than I do with some of the military-minded leaders in my own country. He asks, however, if it's possible to so dissociate ourselves from the state as to stand apart, save to condemn, while enjoying the freedom from the madman's activities which the state secures. He quotes the Bishop of Birmingham, who said no great nation would so shock the conscience of the world as to use aeroplanes against a country that's rendered itself incapable of retaliation. But Weatherhead then notes that dictators are no more afraid of shocking the conscience of the world than burglars are of shocking the conscience of a city. His lengthy thesis on pacifism is encapsulated in the statement that a person can only stand aside at the cost of his duties as a citizen and at the risk of involving his fellow citizens in enormous suffering. His views in support of just war are similarly lengthy, where he quotes the Dean of St. Paul's, who said, "If there's no reasonable prospect of victory, we've embarked on a course that will bring two evils into the world instead of one." And by noting that as a praying church, she must support armed defence against the advancement of the dissolution of the just state, referring to the biblical passage about rendering to Caesar what is Caesar's. Throughout his work, Weatherhead attempts to balance the arguments for peace and for war. He states that war is beastly, but is pacifism satisfactory? And later that the Christian Englishman at the present time, whether he decides for pacifism or national service, must do some wrong in order to do that which he believed to be right. Hoping for a peaceful future, he comments that evil can only tear up the photographs. God holds the negative. In his conclusion, he criticizes political solutions, noting the League of Nations have been unsuccessful, and that to change the names to speak of federal union won't accomplish the magic which changes the pumpkin into the fairy coach. In its closing sentences, Weatherhead claims that in a sentence his theme is the importance to take stock, not to find out what we've got in the shop, but to see whether we've got the price tickets on correctly, and finishes his work by stating that no darkness is so gross that it can block out the light. Returning to the theme of the paper, however, what do these two books suggest about the impact on Westminster College? Firstly, both could be found in the college library, and we know that both authors were well known within the college. As such, their opinions would be familiar to both staff and students alike. It's also possible that the difficulty faced by the denomination to define its teachings, as reflected in these works, would have been found throughout the student body, particularly, and therefore its inability to recruit students following the war, particularly when faced by fierce competition from Anglican colleges, who'd clearly stated their opinions. In contrast to this, the explicit Methodist identity and ethos of the college is likely to have appealed to many nonconformists, the latter of whom did not have their own teacher training colleges, but their lack of explicit messaging could have been a barrier to recruiting those students. What evidence is there for a reduction in student body, you might ask? Firstly, it can be seen in overall student numbers, with the College Board of Trustees in 1917 describing the college as still in being, though the number of students are reduced almost to the vanishing point. There's also a notable dip in the number of Methodists overall, especially within the Wesleyan tradition. It's most evident, however, in the minutes of the Board of Trustees, who complained about the financial struggles, partially because of the decreases in funding from government, but also because of unemployment of young men. It's worth noting, however, that these are still just a small group of views, either within the college or as authors. What does the church as a large organisation think? Whilst it frequently operated outside the constraints faced by other church institutions, educational facilities, and other training colleges, the relationship between Westminster College and the Methodist Church was extensive, and it's essential to recognise in order to fully understand the overall relationship between Westminster College and war. Indeed, the college buildings were owned by the church, its staff appointed by the church, its students accepted or rejected by the church, and its governing policies drafted by the church. At the point of foundation, it required all members of its body to be Wesleyan Methodists, and its principal was an ordained minister until 1940. Indeed, each of these four principals served as president of the conference at one point or another. 3 of the 4 of them also served on its education committee. Indeed, H.B. Workman and A.W. Harrison were both ex officio representatives of Methodist education at the Uniting Conference in 1932. As such, it's a reasonable assumption that many of the official views of the church were mirrored within the college. The final section of this paper will see how true this is. Although it's difficult to explore the views of an overall denomination, it's important to note that reactions to war varied between traditions, congregations, and communities, and even within these groups. As such, any statement misses a level of nuance. In this way, however, the reactions of Methodists mirror those of society as a whole. Indeed, it's this diverse and complicated relationship within Methodism, as well as externally to it, which can partly explain the continued study of and fascination with the history of war, particularly in relation to the First and Second World Wars and conflicts which have occurred since. Indeed, it's a diverse and complicated relationship with war and within Methodism as well. Yeah. Turning first to attitudes expressed prior to the First World War, John Wesley famously described war as being destructive of the work of God in his treatise on an original sin, but established the duality placed within the church, encouraging the creation of a voluntary force from among Methodist communities in opposition to the French invasion. Additionally, the first layperson utilised as an overseas missionary was stationed at the garrison in Gibraltar when he established a Methodist society there. War in the 19th century was similarly recognised as being a necessary evil, and indeed it was the aftermath of the Crimean War that led to the Wesleyan Church establishing both its military trust in Aldershot and its army committee, both tasks designed to support the patriotic calling alongside the ministerial one. By the outbreak of the First World War, therefore, the Church had established a mechanism for supporting its members engaged in conflict and had developed many of its unofficial teachings. By 1914, for the first time, the Wesleyan Church allowed its ministers to become commissioned within the British Army. This attitude supported patriotic endeavours and was highlighted in an address to the King published in the Minutes of Conference in 1915. The Wesleyan Church contributed over 300 ministers as chaplains during the First World War, but this varied greatly between different congregations and traditions. And this largely stands true today, with much of its remaining focus of the Church being on peace and the avoidance of conflict, as seen in its 2004 Stop War postcard design, or the use of peace, protection, and comfort in prayers released by the connections surrounding modern conflict. Outside of these times, and its 2006 statement, which referred to peacemaking, the Methodist Church devotes little time or debate to war in times of peace. As an example of this, Brian Beck's Index to the Agendas of Methodist Conference lists approximately 200 entries for topics linked to war, including disarmament, war memorials, and air raid. Fewer than half of these have been from agendas produced during wars, times loosely labelled as peacetime. The 2023 Methodist Conference, meanwhile, reaffirmed the Methodist Church's long-standing commitment to be a justice-seeking church, and included a suggestion that one version of a just church would be a peaceful one. Given that there are passages in the Bible about the evils of war, it would have been easy for the church to denounce war in all its forms. Despite this theological rooting, many in the Methodist Church viewed the British involvement in the First and Second World Wars as being a battle for what was right in the face of military might. To combat the difficulty it faced, the Methodist traditions in Britain chose to focus on specific elements of warfare, including legally enforced conscription, the arms trade, and nuclear weapons. These competing ideas troubled many Methodists, leading to the difficult contrast in ideals, and has been outlined by both Harrison and Weatherhead in their works. It can also be seen within Workman's Call to Men Back to College in 1914. This paper has sought to explore the impact of war on the Methodist Teacher Training College, originally located in the city of Westminster. It's done so by attempting to understand the actions and views of those within the collegiate family, those stakeholders who directly influence the college, and voices from outside, which had an impact inside its cloistered walls. As has been stated, the views of Westminster College were as nuanced as those of the Methodist Church, and its struggle to concisely state what it thought about war or about peace can be viewed as true for the majority of Methodist communities around the country. In 1914, H.B. Workman summoned cohorts of men to Horseferry Road so that they could enlist together. The Methodist Board of Trustees leased the college estate to the Australian Army, and the only memorials to conflict are to those who died in war. Yet, the college was more than willing to hire conscientious objectors where others wouldn't in the decade which followed the cessation of war, and when the Methodist Church itself had no definitive statements or teachings on war. Indeed, viewing the Methodist tradition as wholly pacifist may also have been seen as disingenuous, with the Church having produced resources for use by those enrolled in the armed forces, and ignored the successes and sacrifices of many Methodists. In the Second World War, the impact of teacher training was greatly reduced, with a majority of the student body being evacuated and teachers listed as an exempt profession. Yet, it does not seem that this reduced impact on institutions impacted on the views held at Westminster College on war as beastly, yet sometimes necessary, almost certainly because of the inescapable nature of these conflicts. Finally, the difficulty to express the explicit attitudes of the Methodist Church, both before and after Union, in relation to conflict and peace at a time when the issues were so personal to all, with everyone having experienced the immediate impacts of warfare, may provide some insight into why the Methodist Church of this century has struggled to do so, but is increasingly focusing on the need to reaffirm or redesign its teachings in line with the values of its increasingly diverse communities. What is certain is that the views of Westminster College and the Church as a whole are far more complex than they have often been shown to be, and continue to be a series of matters that the Church cannot fully agree upon. Perhaps this is something that can be fixed through a more sustained focus on war, and the Methodist Church's provision of chaplaincy and wider support, and/or its beliefs surrounding peace and pacifism, as has been called for by the Methodist Forces Board. Whether this is the case or not, what is evident is that the Methodist Church and many of its members are far more comparable with other denominations, faiths, and those of no faith than they are often portrayed to be. Thank you.